Okay, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get started? Good afternoon. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name's Jeff DeBelko. I'm very fortunate to direct our Environmental Change and Security Program and give you a warm welcome to another forum that we are having here and have had since, in many respects, 1994, both at Smithsonian Castle and then here in the Reagan Building, trying to bring some of these different worlds that we focus on in the Environmental Change and Security Program together. The worlds of environment, in this case with a special focus on climate, development, health, population, and put it in a broader foreign and security policy context and understand that there are a range of links, many contested, many emerging in terms of some consensus understanding, but have an active debate and understanding of how these issues can come together, sharing insights from both the research community and the policy community and those who kind of work between the two of them. So we're very fortunate to have an old friend and a new friend from International Alert. Dan Smith, who's the Secretary General from International Alert, is someone that I've had the good fortune of knowing and working with since the early 90s when he was the head of the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. An institute, by the way, that has been contributing to these sets of questions with high-quality research for literally decades. One of the early contributors and continue to be seminal contributors on these issues. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Dan back to the Wilson Center to come speak again. As I think many of you know, International Alert is a peace-building conflict prevention organization with field offices all over the world. And so I think part of what's interesting today is hearing from both Dan and Shruti Mehrotra, who is a senior consultant and working on this project, someone who's been at the World Economic Forum and a lot of field-based work and relief and humanitarian missions. But hearing from them, on a fundamental level, why is an organization like International Alert really trying to tackle climate change and its links to conflict? In this report, A Climate of Conflict, the links between climate change, peace, and war, one that's come out here 18 months or so ago. But I think part of what's very interesting is now, given that we're in the year of Copenhagen, Dan and Shruti are talking a lot about what does it mean in terms of adaptation in light of the findings that they have found and others have found in this area. So I think kind of very timely for us to engage in this conversation. For those of you, I see a few new faces, so I'll just say you're sitting actually at Woodrow Wilson's formal memorial. Congress created a living memorial in 1968 to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together to reflect his legacy as the only president to have a PhD. As I mentioned, we've been trying to focus a conversation, provide a forum for discussing these issues with the Environmental Change and Security Program since 1994, something that we do both with meetings like this, but then also I hope you will pick up kind of just in from the press this week, our new copy of our annual Environmental Change and Security Program report. You can get in hard copy, and all of which is online as well as on our blog, New Security Beat. So I hope you'll take advantage of those. So I think, Dan, why don't we, without further ado, throw it to you to kick us off.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff, for a nice warm welcome, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I think that one of the most interesting things about the Environment, Conflict and Security Program here has been that it's tried to make links between subjects which are quite often kept distinctly separate. And one of the challenges, I think, of the moment is to understand that what we're talking about as we go into and out of the Copenhagen summit in December this year, the climate summit that is to produce a new post-Kyoto treaty about how the world responds to global warming. What we're talking about is not just about the environment in some drawer over there, and it's not just about development in some drawer over here. And it's not just about conflict in some drawer down there. It's not just about governance and constitutional rule and democracy and transparency and accountability. It's about all of these things together. And that's what makes it difficult sometimes to get to grips with. And I think that in places where the debate around some of these issues has been frozen for a period of time, this now becomes, intellectually and policy-wise, a particularly exciting moment for opening up a whole lot of these issues and moving forward on them on the basis of the connections and the interactions between them. Jeff mentioned that International Alert, which is the organization that I have the honor to lead, is an international peacebuilding organization. We have programs and activities in about 22, 23 countries and territories around the world, and we have offices in, I think, 14 of those countries. And so we're active primarily in trying to generate the social energies and the social cohesion that can underwrite peace processes in conflict-affected countries in different places. We also have a policy arm that does research and does advocacy, and we do this mainly not on specific countries but on cross-cutting issues, on questions of gender, the role of the private sector, community security, effectiveness of aid delivery, what good governance means, and so on. And it was just one of those moments. A group of us were sort of sitting around thinking about issues and big issues and stuff, as one does sometimes at the end of a working day. And we started talking about climate change. And I said, because of the background that I share with Jeff, where I got to know Jeff first, because of my background in peace research, I said, well, you know, what's being done about the conflict dynamics, the conflict implications of climate change? And there was this sort of anxious silence around the room. So then, you know, we went to the sophisticated research tool that we all use when in doubt, Google. And, you know, there were precious few hits. There really were. You know, Google brings up anything, you know, brings up millions of things which are only sort of, you know, half a percentage point relevant to the words which you put into the search in the first place. And really this was not an impressive moment for Google. It didn't find much about climate and conflict that day when we pressed the button to find out. And to me, it seemed relatively obvious, and so we did some work on it, we produced some ideas, we did some media briefings, and then actually it was after the media briefings we realized, oh God, we better do a little piece of solid research, or at least something that looks like solid research, so that we've got a report to wave, so that when we go along and act smart in different places, with any difficult question we can say, well, you know, you can read this and fine. So then we went into it more systematically and we produced this report. Now, it's an odd thing about the climate change debate, the global warming debate, over several years up until the middle of this decade, I think, that maybe because there was so much argument going on about the basic science, maybe because it was, you know, it was difficult even to get to first base in the argument and find consensus there, that in a funny way, although the reason, of course, why we're all worried or concerned about global warming is because of the impact on nature and on humans, actually not a lot was being done to explore what the nature of the human impact really is. And that's essentially what this report and this work is about. I want to hurdle over some points and more or less take them for granted. Climate change is happening. We are seeing the consequences unfolding now. The timing of monsoons in Nepal has changed dramatically. The pattern of typhoons in the Philippines has changed. The tropical glaciers are melting. Those in the Andes will be gone up to the altitude of about 5,000 meters. They'll be gone by 2015. There's photographic evidence that shows the retreat of the glaciers. I don't want to be getting into those kind of arguments right now. What I want to be saying is that given that climate change is unfolding, we need then to look in a systematic and in an inventive, a creative way at what the human impact is, try to understand that, and think about what to do about it. There is, of course, as we all know, a line of thought that has jumped too rapidly to the conclusion, which has gone straight to the punchline before telling the joke properly, and just says climate change will cause conflict. Right. Well, if you take a given conflict, I've been researching peace and conflict for a good proportion of my adult life, and I'm too shy to say how many years that really is, but it's a long time. I don't know of an armed conflict that has got a single cause. Right? Armed conflicts are produced by the interaction of many different, what we nerdy political scientists like to call variables, produced by the interaction of the economy, ethnic difference, the burden of history, such as the consequences of colonialism or of a previous war, the way a country is run, who's in government, who's not part of government, who's included, who's excluded. All of these variables interact together to produce armed conflicts. And our argument is simply that climate change adds another major variable into that mix. Some people like to think of this as being, in some cases, the last but an extremely heavy straw that breaks the camel's back. Some people use the vocabulary of it's a threat multiplier. That's to say you've got threats, you've got problems, climate change multiplies them. It turns up the volume of those problems. It doesn't really matter much how you think about it or how you express it, as long as you understand this important point about the interaction of the consequences of climate change with other features of the social, economic, political reality of a given country. Think of a low-lying country which could be vulnerable to extreme weather events and sea level rise. Just pin that thought in your mind. Try to think of a real country which is very low-lying and might be vulnerable to sea level rise and to extreme weather events. If it's the Netherlands, you think they'll look after themselves pretty successfully. If it's Bangladesh, you think that although they have a lot of initiative and enterprise, they're going to need a lot of international assistance in order to be able to survive and adapt and cope with climate change. The difference between Netherlands and Bangladesh is not the natural consequences which they're facing. The difference is the difference between Netherlands and Bangladesh, right? The difference between a wealthy country with stable government that's transparent and accountable to the people, and a country like Bangladesh, which is poor, which has got democracy, but it's a very iffy democracy. It's really still in a state of transition, and which does not itself have the resources to handle those problems. So Bangladesh may be a place where we might think that there could be great social pressure as a consequence of climate change. The Netherlands, we would probably think that there would not be. And just thinking about those two simple examples takes one a long way towards thinking about what the problem is and where solutions might lie. Now, the variables through which the impact is going to be felt. Key one is water. When thinking about climate change, it's water. Is anybody in the audience of Irish extraction? I apologize. There's a law which in British English is known as Murphy's Law. That's why I apologize. What can go wrong will go wrong. Murphy's Law of climate change is that if you live in an area which has too little water, you're going to have less. And if you live in a region where you get too much water, for example, in the form of floods and extreme weather events and rainstorms, you're going to have more. It doesn't matter what your current water-related problem is, it's going to be worse. Murphy's Law of climate change. That's going to affect food supply, food security. It's going to affect livelihoods, livelihood security. It's going to affect, in a way, the habitability of the human habitat in very many places around the world, and in different ways. In the northeast part of South Asia, the Ganges-Brahmaputra river system, it is partially dependent on monsoon rains and partially dependent on glacial runoff. And both those sources of supply for the river system are affected by climate change. 400 million people depend upon that river system for their daily needs, for industry and agriculture. So a very large number of people's livelihoods are going to be affected if water management in the Ganges-Brahmaputra area is not adequate to the task of facing up to the challenges of climate change. Peru, something like 70% or more of the Peruvian population is dependent for their water on glacial runoff. And that's going. So first of all, there's going to be a surplus of water, and then there's going to be a terrible deficit of water for those 70% of people. How water management is done will be crucial for deciding what kind of problems Peruvian society is facing. In the very foreseeable future, as I said earlier on, the glaciers will essentially be gone by 2015. When the human habitat becomes less viable, as resources get narrower and scarcer, I think one looks for two major kinds of response, or two major risks in the response. One is that there will be conflict over those more scarce resources. And the other one is whether, in part because of the conflict or in order to evade it, people will move. There are a lot of factoids and guesstimates being thrown around about how many people will migrate under the pressure of climate change, and I don't want to add to those. There are at the moment about 200 million people living outside the country of their birth. That's about 3% of the world population. If you think what I just said about the Ganges-Brahmaputra river system, that's 400 million people who are dependent upon it. It is reasonable to think that there is going to be migration on a scale that we haven't really previously experienced in consequence of climate change if water management fails. And when people migrate, when they move, of course, sometimes they move because of conflict or to avoid it, as well as moving because they see better opportunities elsewhere. Very often, unwittingly, they become the vector of conflict themselves. The places where they migrate to, I think most people who've been looking at this in the climate change context would more or less agree with the proposition that most of this migration is not going to be from the poor world to the rich world. It's either going to be migration within countries, within India, within Egypt, within Bangladesh, right? Or it's going to be migration within the region, across the border, but to neighboring countries. And whether it's internal migration or just cross-border migration, then a lot of that migration is going to be people moving from areas which are no longer viable to areas which are barely viable. Indeed, where their arrival threatens the viability of the area into which they're moving. And then you simply start to find yourself replaying the original conflict scenario from the point of origin to the point of destination, which becomes a new point of origin of migration, and on it moves. When we looked at this issue in this report, we thought that these kinds of problems were going to be too much for a number of countries, and that there would probably be conflicts which the governments and the local institutions and the informal modes of handling conflict as well as the formal modes would be unable to manage, and that some of these conflicts would turn violent and that some of them would translate into open armed conflict, into warfare. And we thought that that risk at that most serious of levels, that we could identify it in 46 countries. And the combined population of those 46 countries at the time that we were doing the research was 2.7 billion people. The number is so high because it includes India. And it doesn't mean to say that India would be engulfed by civil war. You need to understand something about developing countries, including large ones, and about armed conflict in the modern age in order to really understand what I'm saying and to get it back a little bit down under control and into perspective. I'm 46 countries and 2.7 billion people. Oh, you freeze in front of that. But it's 46 countries in which 2.7 billion people are living. I lived in a country where there was a civil war going on. That civil war was going on for 25 years, and mainly I couldn't see it. I remember seeing it one Christmas when shops in London were being closed because of IRA bomb threats. And I remember not seeing it but feeling it come very close to me about 1989 or 1990 when my wife and daughter passed through Victoria Station in London about an hour before an unwarned bomb exploded. But the war in Northern Ireland went on for 25 years without most people in Britain having any close experience of it. I had friends who lived in Pristina in Kosovo while the civil war was going on, before the NATO bombing, but while the civil war was going on. They said the same thing was true there. You could live an ordinary life in Pristina without knowing that without seeing that only about 30 miles away, right, a civil war was raging. So India, which is an extremely large country, already has many areas essentially of anarchy and chaos and what you could call armed conflict. The Naxalites, Nagaland, the Northeast, Bihar, other areas. And it's that kind of conflict that one is talking about when talking about these 46 countries home to 2.7 billion people. We also thought that these kinds of problems would be enough to add to other problems and threaten the political stability of another 56 countries with a combined population of 1.2 billion people. And one of the things I think that struck people about this report was that we were dumb enough to actually list the countries so that you can check out and see what you think. Sometimes these figures are thrown around and you don't get a chance to see what is the basis of the calculation. But we list the countries, and we're talking about risk. We're not talking about prediction. Now, that's the scenario of risk that we need to be thinking about. How do we manage? How do we respond to that? In 2007, when we were doing this, the international community had an answer. It said, well, you've got to cut emissions, head for a low-carbon economy, and then, global warming will slow down and stop, and things will be okay. And in a footnote at the bottom, you could often find adaptation will be required in the meantime. What is really meant is that however good the Copenhagen Agreement is, however wonderful its provisions are, however ambitious, and however magnificently it is implemented with total consistency and determination across the next 2 or 3 decades, during those 2 or 3 decades, many, many countries will bear the brunt of the effects of climate change. And it is an iron law of these things that, of course, the poorest will bear the heaviest burden, and the poorest of the poor will bear an even heavier one. That's why talking about climate change means one must be talking about development. And my arguments about conflict risk explain why talking about climate change, one must also be talking about conflict and peace. It seems to me that the response which we need to take towards this, and Shruti is going to go into some details of this and try to unpack the term a little bit, but it's a combination of adaptation and peace building. I want to say a little bit about the two and then hand over to Shruti. When people talk about adaptation, adapting to climate change, okay. First of all, up until a couple of years ago, I think, as I said, adaptation was a footnote, and a lot of the environmental NGOs and activists didn't want you to talk about adaptation very much. If you talk about adaptation, which is about coping with climate change, that sounds like too much of offering an alibi to rich northern governments. You don't have to do anything about climate change. Give the poor people some money and they can cope with climate change, and meanwhile carry on driving your SUVs and flying everywhere you feel like it. I think now there's a better and a more balanced view. However much we mitigate, however quickly we get onto a low-carbon pathway, there is still a problem there, and we've got to address that problem properly. And that problem is about coping. There's a lot of discussion, Shruti will touch on it in her remarks, about the scale of adaptation, about the mechanisms for adaptation. There also needs to be more discussion than I see at the moment about the reality, the substance of adaptation. If adaptation, if coping with climate change is expressed as, some barrages on the river, some sandbags, build the Dutch dikes higher, do whatever it is you need to do to the levees which should be around New Orleans, watch out for the North Sea surge if you're in Britain, better cyclone warning if you're Bangladesh, plus more floating farms and all of the other extraordinarily creative things that they've done. If it's seen purely in technical measures, we've got it wrong. Adaptation is a social process that people need to buy into. People in their communities, in villages and streets, in their houses, in their personal lives, as well as in who they vote for, need to understand what adaptation is about, why they need to do it, and then they will go along with it. If they do not understand about it. If the information campaigns which are carried out are dismissive or are over-technical or do not give room for people to ask questions and express their doubts, people won't buy into it, and then it won't happen. It will be an alien imposition coming down on people. And that doesn't matter whether you think of it as being something that's imposed by the international community or by the national government. In the communities and in the villages, it'll feel alien and people won't go along with it. So adaptation will only work if it is a bottom-up process, as well as needing a top-down strategy and international funding. I could almost withdraw the word adaptation from the sentences that I just spoke, replace it with peacebuilding, and make exactly the same point with exactly the same confidence and certainty and in urgency. If peacebuilding is seen as being something that governments do for people, it won't work. Right? Where peace agreements go wrong, it's because the government and whoever, another government or the parties, the rebels, signed an agreement between themselves. But where they go wrong, it's because you don't get the social energy and the social basis coming in behind. And that social basis is, again, made up of people understanding what is happening, buying into it. In Rwanda, take an example. It's the toughest example to take because of the genocide. 120,000 people were put in prison for the genocide. And many of them are now being released. They've got to go live somewhere. They're going back to their villages. They're going back to where they did the murder. Right? There's a film called My Neighbor, My Murderer. We're working with some microfinancing projects in Rwanda. One of the women that we're working with is extraordinary. She decided to go into partnership with the man who killed her husband. Now that triumph of the human over the abominable, that triumph of reconciliation, seems to me to be part of what peacebuilding is about. You can't dictate that from government. You can't force that by giving grants or by giving money. It comes through from the bottom. So both peacebuilding and adaptation are these bottom-up processes which go hand in hand. And that was the last conclusion of our report, was that where you have a double threat of conflict and the burden of climate change, you actually have a unified solution. Because a community or a society which can recover from violent conflict, you can imagine that society being able to have the kind of discussions and conversations and participation which is needed for successful adaptation. And similarly, a society which can adapt so it becomes resilient to climate change, you can imagine that having the capacity to be able to handle and resolve conflicts as they arise. So being resilient against conflict and resilience against climate change are essentially the same thing. So oddly enough, you look at the coming together of these threats of climate change and conflict and the burden that they will place on people and the obstacles they will place in the way of development. You look at those two problems for long enough and you find grounds for optimism and for realizing that there are things that can be done and indeed will be done. So I'll pass over to Shruti.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe I'll give you a second to think through the nuanced message that Dan has given around how difficult some of these issues are to tackle on the ground. It's an interesting nuanced version of something that is actually quite complicated that the world doesn't know very much about, which is how to do adaptation. There aren't very many projects that have been labeled as adaptation, understandably, because climate impacts, no single hurricane can be identified as being one that was caused by climate change. We all know that, and thus there are many development projects that have climate impacts ingrained in them that have not been labeled as adaptation. So some of the best work so far that's been done on an inventory of what adaptation projects are is something that WRI has done, but there are only a couple hundred projects that one can say so far in the world are actually doing these things. Most of them are generally development projects in which climate impacts have been overlaid on top of them. So we're entering into a space where the answers are incredibly nuanced in the way that Dan has been describing them, but the amount of history that the world has of being able to implement these projects is very, very low. Yet at the same time, we're in the year of a negotiation that is going to be the most important year for climate change, as people say, this year and next for sure. And is a massive burden for the international community to come up with a framework that is able to answer very complicated questions with a huge amount of uncertainty and very little experience from the past as to how to implement adaptation programs. One can imagine as a result that the way that the policy debate is going so far is that it's incredibly simplistic. The simplistic way of looking at it is that the G77 is asking the developed world for money. Or actually, no, they're not even asking, they're demanding it. It's compensation using the polluter pays principle that, polluters have to pay for all of the damages that have been caused. And so this has become, in a very simplistic way, a debate about money when it should be a debate and a challenge around how to implement very complicated and socially based, from the ground up adaptation actions. The quantities of money that we're talking about are in the tens of billions. So what we're talking about is additional funding to ODA in the tune of, or at least $50 to $100 billion are the estimates that people have made. Now, in the next couple of months, there are probably going to be 1 or 2 additional studies that take into account the most recent climate change studies that have been done by scientists that will increase those numbers, because climate change is happening faster than what people had considered. So we may not be talking about $100 billion. We may be talking about $150 or $200 billion as the price tag, which would involve nearly doubling or over doubling ODA. So these are very large sums of money that policymakers are debating, and the discourse for now is you cause the impact, you pay for the actions undertaken in order for us to address the impacts that were caused by pollution in the developed world. So it's a difficult argument to get your head around when you take into account the fact that all of these things are very nuanced and have to be started from the bottom up in terms of how these issues are addressed. To complicate it even more, one has to take into account that we have experience from 30 years of doing development. And most of development discourse is not being taken into account in these environmental negotiations. And so I spent some time last year in Bonn at one of the negotiations, and it was quite interesting that you meet negotiators from the G77 who are not development experts, maybe forestry people, but may also be the chief of meteorology from a particular country. And that person is being asked by their nation to represent what is fundamentally a development challenge for them. And so there's a couple of different leaps as we see it that this negotiation must make in a very short period of time. One is from the environmental realm, linking it across the stovepipe to development, because that is effectively what adaptation is. And then even worse, because of the impacts on state fragility, is also into issues like peacebuilding. And one can argue that right now development doesn't really understand peacebuilding, and now we're asking environmentalists to understand development who would then understand also peacebuilding. So this is an incredibly complicated set of leaps that need to happen. From our perspective, what is going to happen in Copenhagen will not be a detailed deal. One can't expect that. What it will provide is an overarching framework, and the ask, and the most realistic ask, for those who are looking at the impacts on state fragility has to effectively be one that says a deal that allows one to create architecture underneath that enables this type of activity rather than disincentivizes it. So it's not to say that all of these things will be ingrained into a deal at the end of the year, but rather that deal is structured in such a way over the next couple of years that when we get into the details, these issues can be addressed in due time. There is no expectation that the deal will be comprehensive at the end of the year. I think there's an expectation that there will be a deal, but there are pretty reasonable expectations that the deal won't be good enough. It might not be good enough on mitigation, but it probably also won't be good enough on adaptation, but it will be there. And so what I think we're looking to do for this year is to have something that's enabling rather than disabling. Now, specifically, if I go into sort of where the negotiations are, there are some major challenges around adaptation funding. Again, the scale is a lot less than one would want. But the other challenge that I think we struggle with is when you look at the mechanisms that are being discussed, again, they don't take into account this long set of development knowledge that the international development community has been building up over time, and the peacebuilding communities that understands how to undertake these types of activities. So the way that the mechanism is currently being discussed, at least one of them, involves governance that doesn't engage any of this history of development experience. And it's mainly, you know, developing countries who are managing the adaptation fund, not necessarily linking into the experience that USAID might have or the Department for International Development in the UK. And it means that there is a potential that a huge amount of money will be put into this, but using a way of thinking about development from the 1970s, not taking into account all of the lessons that have been learned to date. So not to end on a absolutely negative note, you know, the election of the Obama administration has been game-changing in the way that climate change is looked at on an international level. There's a huge amount of energy and expectation that the U.S. government will act as a leader on all different parts of the climate change debate, so mitigation, adaptation, and others. The fact that China has allocated over 40% of its stimulus package to green investments is a massive push in the direction that the G2, the United States and China, can come up with a deal. So there are very positive movements on all of these fronts that are, you know, building momentum to get to a deal in Copenhagen. But the question of how much money and how that money will be governed need to include enabling mechanisms to address these more nuanced challenges. And that's, I think, our community's challenge is to try and make those two leaps. One that takes the environmentalist to understand development, and also, secondly, into looking at issues of state fragility. Otherwise, we may end up spending a lot of money that might generate more conflict rather than less.
Well, thank you very much, Dan and Shruti. It's you've given us a lot to think about and kind of helped us bridge some of these communities in terms of understanding your analysis and how you came to it and why a group like International Alert would see this as front and center as a concern. So why don't we open it to the discussion? I should have mentioned up front we're webcasting this, so for the Q&A we'll have microphones. If you could let us know who you are. Why don't we start with Seth down here in front? So Kayla, if you could bring it right down to the middle.
Seth Borenstein from the Associated Press. For Shruti, you talked about the not being the right types of adaptation. Can you give us a little more specifics in terms of you're talking, they're not thinking things, gaining lessons learned 20, 30, 10 years ago. Can you give us an example of the type of adaptation that is being considered that you would consider not the right type, and perhaps some examples, if there are any, in fragile states where there is adaptation at least being discussed, or the right type of adaptation? Maybe one example someplace doing it right.
You know, examples are pretty hard to come by. We've been having a debate over the last couple of days about good versus bad examples and labeling versus others, and I'm going to defer to Dan for some additional fragile state examples. But in principle, if I speak about the mechanisms, right now one of the primary mechanisms that's being considered for adaptation funding at the international level is the Adaptation Fund. That fund, one of the big sort of political wins for the G77, as you probably know, in Bali, was that the governance of that fund would be developing countries. Now, that makes good sense from this sort of notion of compensation, that they are being compensated for the damages that were caused to them. That makes reasonable sense, and that thus they govern and control the money that comes through. Now, what one would want is some sort of a partnership between those developing countries and organizations, bilateral aid agencies and multilateral international organizations working in development to help link the policies and experience that those agencies have had across many countries of doing development with the ownership of developing countries. So you would want the governance experts, for example, from USAID or from DFID to be advisors to that kind of a mechanism in some way, because DFID and USAID have been developing experience on how to deal with difficult governance issues over time. Right now, the structure is not being discussed in that way, and that it is developing countries themselves who are managing these funds and then dispersing them without any of those bits of advice that have proven over time to be helpful in development. And so that is slightly disconcerting if one believes that some of the more difficult and touchy issues like governance need to be a part of any type of funding mechanism, that development requires thinking about those things rather than just being a transfer of funds from one place to another.
So are they actually talking about using them in ways that don't really follow adaptation? In other words, where it's not building seawalls where it should be a seawall, or bigger dams, or species relocation. I mean, are there cases where they're talking about doing something entirely non-adaptation oriented with the money? And
I can't say that people are talking about using adaptation funding to do non-adaptation activities, but the way that the structures are set up is that the recipients are the people who are governing the fund, which again could make reasonable sense, but having some type of check and balance to ensure that these funds are used appropriately would always make sense. And I'm not sure, Dan, if you want to add some thoughts.
I think there's one set of problems, which is that sort of the mechanics and the instruments at the international level. The second question you asked is about examples of good and bad adaptation. I'll give you an example of adaptation that just went wrong. Didn't have negative consequences, but it didn't have the intended positive consequences. Last August in Nepal, there were floods. The river, I forget the name, broke its banks. Some 40,000 people were displaced. And that was part of a sort of sequential flooding going down the river system, which also hit India and then indeed Bangladesh as well. Now, it is well known that there was a key barrage, small dam, that needed to be fixed. And an Indian company went in to fix it. So everything is set up to do this right, and probably either to minimize or actually avoid flooding, and certainly avoid the river breaking its banks. But there was a labor dispute. Now, in Nepal, a labor dispute is not just a labor dispute in the sense of between the workers and the employer, who was in this case an Indian contractor. It's a labor dispute between the different trade unions, who are all themselves politically aligned, and including aligned with the Maoists, who, although they were in government at that time, the Young Communist League, had a somewhat robust way of dealing with and relating to people with whom it found areas of disagreement. As a result of that, the strike paralyzed the activity. The Indian contractors were sort of aghast and dumbfounded. They didn't know what was going on. They turned to the provincial authorities and said, listen, either you've got to broker a deal or send in the police to essentially break the strike. And the provincial authorities said, not. We'll have to see what the national government can do. The national government, being a multi-party coalition, in a fragile state, just coming out of conflict and extremely dysfunctional, and in which the Environment Ministry is the most junior ministry, which can't get political attention from and action from the top, was unable to do anything. So the Indian contracting company sat there and watched while the floods came, the barrage broke, the banks of the river were broken. And so that was adaptation being undertaken and being tried, and you could see the weight of the consequences of conflict and the fragile state preventing that adaptation from working. In the Philippines, you'd have to come back to me and I'd have to look it up. I've actually got it on a paper on my laptop, but I can't remember the name. The governor of the province is called Joey Alceda, but I can't remember the province it's referring to. He has mainstreamed climate adaptation into the province's economic development strategy, so that whenever they're thinking about a school or a hospital or a road, they're thinking about its vulnerability and it's the changing pattern of vulnerability because of the changing pattern of the typhoons. So they're thinking about, they're just, when you sit down and you think about building something, they're thinking about the impact of climate. And he's just sort of declared that. And then when he makes the presentation about this strategy, probably some 70% of what he's talking about is their information strategy, of how they make sure that this information gets out to everybody and how people have the chance then to ask questions and participate in discussions, learn more, and then start feeding their own ideas in. Because one of the things in the examples that I heard him giving was that very often, you know, people who are living in the places which are most affected are going to be the best source of ideas for how to deal with some of the problems that come up.
Is it fair to say that sounds more than what many developed countries like the United States are even doing on adaptation?
Sure. And I think, I mean, there was a case. Now I'm showing my age because it was either late 2007 or late 2008. The largest ever, it must have been late 2007, the largest ever surge in the North Sea was experienced. So this was going to hit both the UK on the East Coast and the Netherlands. And I read about this in the newspaper, and my daughter was doing a temporary job for the City Council of Norwich, which is the county town of Norfolk, there in the east of England. And what I read about in the paper was that, you know, the cabinet committee was going to meet, the emergency committee was going to meet, and that a big situation room had been created in Norwich City Hall for, you know, so you could really handle the crisis. And next day in the newspaper and on the radio bulletins that evening of the day of the big surge, nothing, no news at all, right? Nothing had happened. The sea had surged as predicted. Right? At about 9 o'clock in the morning, the cabinet committee, they looked around the table at each other, said, well, you know, we've made all the preparations. That's about it. Let's go home. So they did. They went back and did their day jobs. And I asked my daughter what it was like in the town hall. And she said, well, you know, not really very much happened. Every hour a phone call came in with the latest reports, and everybody ran around looking important. And then they stopped after about 5 minutes and turned to her and said, could you make us a cup of tea? Because that's how we English react to those kinds of... The preparations had all been made. The institutions are extremely strong. The financial and economic investment had been made. As far as engagement of ordinary people in this, right, nothing was happening in the UK because nothing needed to happen. And so in some places you will find extremely strong institutions that are looking after it. And then the danger is that individuals and communities are doing nothing. And in other places you have very weak institutions. And then you need leaders like this guy, Governor Joey Alceda, who says, okay, well, with weak institutions, then we have to get the communities and the people involved and the non-governmental organizations and civil society, because that's compensating for the weakness of the individuals. But I agree, in terms of result, at the end of the road, what he is up to is considerably more sophisticated than most of what you would find in most other, including extremely rich countries.
I'm going to go in the back wall right there. If you could wait for a microphone so folks can hear your question, particularly our colleagues online.
Hi. I was kind of surprised at, Shruti said that, what is it, Mehrotra said that that it's hard to define what an adaptation action is. And I guess I always thought of adaptation as just an action like a development action or building a bridge or levees or whatever that has sort of a time dependence that's influenced by what you know about the future climate. You know, for a concrete example, and I wonder how this affects your example of the British with the sea surge. Or would that institution also be able to put a little time-dependent factor that said this surge would increase over time, and the probability of it being a much greater than normal surge is X, Y, Z, or whatever. I mean, would that institution be able to do that, or would it need to be bottom-up? So that was one question, and I had sort of a related question about the time scale of these things. I thought it was a really good point that you need adaptation until your mitigation kicks in. But what about, I mean, climate change, both adaptation and mitigation sound really gradual to me, and climate change isn't gradual. It's like really sudden, and it seems even more sudden than we thought. And I'm wondering if there's something else that we need sort of before we get to adaptation. You know, do we need some kind of response? I guess some people see it's it's a resiliency type of thing. So those are my comments/questions.
And if you could just let us know who you are.
Oh, I'm Tina Karsberg. I'm with the Department of Energy.
Thank you very much.
I think that the difficulty of defining adaptation actions is a little bit like defining what peacebuilding is. A few years ago, we were having this discussion. I did a survey of peacebuilding projects by 4 donor governments, and talking with people in the development ministries of these governments, trying to define what was a peacebuilding action and what wasn't, it became clear that you couldn't define it by the content of the activity, for almost the reason that you said. I mean, building a bridge might be part of adaptation, or it might be part of development infrastructure and have nothing to do with climate change as such. Even more, you might be building the bridge as part of developing the infrastructure of a country, but the way in which you build that bridge, exactly where you put it, what materials you use, what margins of error you have to include in the calculations, and so on, how you engineer it, may very well be different because of climate change. So when you take those into account, now you're doing adaptation. So building the bridge is the two things at the same time. It's a development action and it's an example of adaptation. And I think that we go astray when we're thinking about these issues, if we think about development as being this, and adaptation on top, right? What needs to happen is that in poor countries, but also in rich countries, development is adapted. That's essentially what adaptation means. And we will find it, I think, impossible in 20 years' time to be saying whether what you're doing now in this place in northern Uganda is climate change adaptation or development, because it's contributing to the country's development in a way that has been adapted to take account of climate change, and it will be a single action as a result. In terms of the sort of the question that you were asking about the institutions in the UK or in other countries which are looking at risk, for example, in the form of sea surges or frequency of extreme weather events and so on. I mean, it's all dependent upon climate modelling, which is getting better and better, which is narrowing the gap between a sort of a guess and a fact all the time. But I was told by somebody working in DFID in Nepal the following little factoid, that the UK government looks at about 50 different climate models when it's thinking about the impact of climate and weather variability on the United Kingdom. That the Indian government has one model, which it looks at, and the government of Nepal has precisely no models at which it looks. So that issue of knowledge and of risk assessment is itself a barometer of the different conditions in which different countries are and of how much assistance is required in order to define the scale of the adaptation task in Nepal or in India, Bangladesh, Chad, and so on and so forth. Second part of the question?
Timescale.
Timescale.
Yeah.
How high is this table? It's about a meter, about 3 feet high, something like that. I mean, what's the approximate calculation? There's been 30 centimeters of sea level rise already because of global warming. There's another 30 to 35 centimeters which is in the system, which hasn't yet fed through because of warming that has occurred, but the consequence hasn't fed out. And then there's another 30 to 35 centimeters in most of the scenarios which are being thought about as the basis for mitigation targets at the Copenhagen conference. In other words, compared to pre-industrial levels, we're planning on a 1 meter rise in sea levels by 2050. That will be slow build-up. That's slow onset. In the course of the perspective of the history of the world, it's extremely fast. But, year by year, there will be this slow erosion. And I think that the UNDP, in its report last year or the year before last, came out at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, pointed out that in a way, if you have a lot of extreme weather events, they build up in a slow way, they build up pressure. So even though the event itself is dramatic and sudden, it's not one event which is causing the problem. It's not 2 or 3, it's 5 or 6 coming in the same hurricane season when there used to be only 1 or 2 that would come. So I think that this pressure is going to keep on building. More or less everybody, I think, who's trying to write about this in a strategic way would agree with a kind of the implication of what you were saying, is there's going to be residual risk. Right? However good adaptation is, there are going to be places where indeed the seawall breaks, the riverbanks burst, floods happen, people need to move from areas. However good the adaptation is, there is going to need to be assistance coming in, sometimes in the form of humanitarian assistance because there's an emergency as people leave an area, and sometimes in a much slower over time, over a decade, as people slowly leave a place, for example. But adaptation is not going to solve every single climate-related problem. It's simply it's a way of responding to and managing the risks, of reducing the likelihood and the frequency of the very tragic events that we might otherwise see all too frequently.
Dennis, in the back.
Hi, Dan. Dennis Dimick from National Geographic. You early on talked about water management and then linking it to food, and I'm trying to think of a couple of examples of specific, essentially preemptive adaptation. When you start talking about drought tolerance, heat tolerance, saltwater tolerance, I mean, money that needs to be set aside to develop that kind of thing, that's a long time scale investment. You just can't be that's not just a reactive response to crisis. That's sort of, you have to start funding that kind of work years, if not decades in advance, right? I mean, that needs to be part of this whole question too, if you're trying to build resilience into these communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for everybody who has been sensing the urgency and the importance of the global warming and climate change package of issues across the last decade, the frustration has been that with each year that we wait to do something, the investment which is needed, must happen that much more quickly, at that much larger a scale, with therefore that much more chance of things going wrong. I mean, we have to do a whole lot of things now. We've got to invent new institutions which are able to handle this. If the Copenhagen Treaty produces great commitments, but doesn't include amongst that a commitment to make the right institutional arrangements, you might as well not make the commitments in the first place. You've got to have the goals, the targets, the commitments, and you've got to have the means for doing it at the same time. This is an enormously demanding task, and every year, is it all right to say this? Every year of that damned administration that we had to wait for action to be taken was a doubly tragic year for the planet and for its population. And that, I think, is why it's so important what Shruti said. It's about the game-changing nature of the election of the Obama administration. It's not to do with changing the atmosphere. It's not to do with the feel-good factor. It's to do with bringing a big player to the table in the right mood to play. Not that then we think that the Obama administration is going to give free handouts to the world. We expect the administration to be negotiating on the basis of US national interest, just as we expect the EU powers to be doing that, and India and China and all. But the negotiation can at least happen. And that is such a huge relief, and that is such a huge change, because the task simply gets bigger the more that we delay it.
See the microphone come down here in front, Keely.
Thank you, Heather Jeffen. And wanted to ask, what is the hazardous disposal, or which been accused of developed country doing it to developing country? And this is going on for as long as I remember, 25 years or so, the impact on first climate change and the impact on conflict or peace building, because obviously recently in Somalia there were very agitated group from, I remember Bulgaria deposit in the Mediterranean that destroy all the agriculture in neighboring country, which is in the Middle East. And we don't speak about it, and you don't see the link, but yet in the process of building peace, I think they play a major factor. And I don't hear much comment on how it's related to the climate change.
Mercifully, Dan, you can cover a lot of topics, so perhaps that one as well, briefly? No?
No, I'm not aware of. I haven't read any literature that relates hazardous waste disposal to climate change. That relates it to the fragility of states. Yes, but that's because the more fragile and corrupt the state is, the easier it is for Western corporations to dispose of extremely poisonous material there. And there's a case now, isn't there, going through the courts in London, I think, about waste disposal in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, which is absolutely scandalous. I mean, this is one where somebody was saying that, I don't know what the thing would be in Washington, but somebody said that if you disposed of this waste in the way that it was done at Trafalgar Square in London, then everybody as far out as into rural Kent would be ill. Right? I mean, this was just appalling. The smell was incredible. The smell itself made people throw up, even before the gases really started to do damage to the membranes of the nose and the lungs and so on. I think it was just one time. It was a one-time disposal, if I'm right. And the company has done everything it can to try and avoid responsibility. It's used huge threats against reporters who were wanting to report it, but finally it's come to court in London. But it's because Côte d'Ivoire was conflict affected and a fragile state and had corrupt people in key positions in authority that this was able to happen. I don't think it was the waste disposal was the cause of the problem. Jeff, I defer to you. You know more about the environment.
Terrific. No, thank you. Very elegant. Yes. Why don't we do a couple questions on this side?
Dan Milstein, DOE. You mentioned just a few moments ago about climate models reducing the uncertainty, but my question is about at the local level, though, where these adaptation projects have to go forward. The climate models they lack precision, to put it kindly. I mean,
they have country-sized gaps in them.
Right. So, in speaking with the climate modelers, they're trying to address this. They're trying to downscale it. But the fact is, this is years out, optimally, that we'll have any kind of meaningful local scale predictions, which themselves are still, very much uncertain. I mean, we're seeing uncertain impacts. We totally missed the boat on the speed and scale of changes in the Arctic and elsewhere. So at the local level, the uncertainty band it's very wide. So how do you give guidance, or what thoughts do you have about, with the decisions that have to be made now and in coming years at the local level, how do you actually give guidance for adaptation or development projects with that uncertainty?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. It gets right to the nerve of the issue, and it does so at two levels. One is at the sort of bigger macro level and the political level. Most people who think about political strategy, tactics, and communication would agree that what you really need in your narratives with which you're going to win support is certainty and simplicity. Right? And as you've just pointed out, we have neither certainty nor simplicity. We actually have doubt and estimation and grounded speculation on the one hand, and we have complex interactions between different variables on the other. So this is a world in which our sort of basic political instincts about how people get elected and do politics and relate to their constituents don't really quite work. And I think that there needs to be, in some ways, addressing just exactly that problem. in policy circles, we're going to have to make risk analysis and risk frameworks so much more sophisticated. And those politicians who would be specializing in these issues, and in the case of countries that are run like the UK, where an elected politician will aspire towards running a Department of State, that's a sort of a standard ambition for a Member of Parliament to have. They will need to have much more literacy, or numeracy maybe, in risk calculation, risk assessment. At the same time, we need to keep these sort of compelling and therefore sometimes simpler narratives, so that people who don't have the specialization to understand the complexity of the risk framework can nonetheless be part of that process. I think the second thing is that people are likely to understand, at least, you're going through a health reform in this country, aren't you, along with all the other things? Yeah. Yeah, well, so I won't include the American citizens yet in my generalization, right? But in Europe, we sort of agree that prevention is better than cure. That's the basic case for a national health service, right? Is to minimize the risk. Wouldn't it be, I don't know if I'm going to get polio, but wouldn't it be better if I was inoculated? I don't know if I'm going to get smallpox, but wouldn't it be better if I were vaccinated before smallpox was killed out? I don't know if a malarial mosquito is going to bite me, but when I'm traveling to malarial zones, I take the pills despite the fact that they sometimes give me headaches. It's a risk minimization process. Nick Stern, in the Stern Review, the former World Bank chief economist and chief economic advisor to the UK government, when he did his review of climate change economics, he said, look, this is win-win, right? If we don't do this, it could be a disaster, so we'd better do it. And if we do it, and the disaster actually wasn't going to happen, there's all sorts of other ways in which we benefit from it anyway. The air is cleaner, the cars are quieter. In the case of the UK, the houses have fewer drafts. I mean, who could object to any of that? So I think that at the local level with adaptation, that is again the kind of approach that needs to be taken. Yeah, we cannot be sure that the sea level here is going to rise by this height as opposed to that height, but we know there's a sea level issue. Right? We cannot be sure about how extreme climate variability is going to get. We can't be sure about the frequency of extreme weather events in the next 10 to 20 years, but we know that there is such a risk. We know that we might be part of that risk zone, and if I employ Joe and Stefan to put proper flood defences up, then at least I've given them a job, and there's good has come out of that, right? So I really think it's something as simple as being on the safe side. We need to slightly over-insure on all of these things at the local level. And if we do, we will find probably that there will be a whole lot of other, economically speaking and socially speaking, multiplier spin-off benefits as well.
Maybe,
sure,
sorry, just to add another word, maybe against the notion of simplicity, but a lot of the climate models also need to get integrated with broader scenarios of how places are going to develop. And so, one has to look at, natural population growth, rural to urban migration, all different types of economic activities. If you look at major cities in India, or especially coastal areas, there are a lot of changes that will naturally happen that then you have to integrate those sort of range of climate scenarios onto. And so to have a multi-dimensional sort of scenario planning process within the context of a risk framework is incredibly important, because we can't just take climate on one side and say, okay, let's talk about climate change with city planners in Mumbai. I mean, you have to look at the way that the city will naturally develop and some of the challenges that Mumbai is having to address. And so the idea of engaging in sort of multi-dimensional scenarios in which climate is one of those factors, in the same way that, looking at sort of peace and conflict issues in which climate is one of those variables, is important that people sort of look at these things in that kind of a context in order to then answer the climate question, as well as the sort of migration question, as well as other vectors of state fragility and general development issues.
Yeah, I think particularly it prompts, since you were talking about this in context of conflict and also how to frame it, as Dan Wells knows, that we're hearing more, at least in the U.S. context, not just the health analogy, but the linkage with the security community that does a lot of risk analysis, makes big investments to plan for the worst and hope for the best, but it's based on both a notion of prevention and an understanding that you make big investments for things that you hope never happen, but don't even have the additional benefit that, as you said, you get a lot of benefits for having made the expenditures anyway. Yeah, right down here.
Hello, my name is Amina Khan, and I'm from Georgetown University. Thank you for the presentation. It was actually wonderful to listen to you. So apart from the notion of climate, as we have talked, there's also the geopolitical climate and the context in which international relations and security run. So do you think that the 46 countries that you have mentioned, there will be some countries that will be strategically important and will run into conflict because of climate change? And given that scenario, do you think the international community, especially developed countries, and particularly the U.S., will or has reached a level of maturity that narrow geopolitical interests should be superseded to tackle this overall problem of climate change?
Yeah, I don't think that you will ever see politics put aside in order to handle these issues. When the tsunami went ripping through Indonesia and Sri Lanka, as well as Thailand, Bill Clinton expressed the hope, even the belief, that this awful tragedy would at least have one good thing, which it was that it would unite people and would bring them together to resolve those conflicts in Aceh in Indonesia and between the Tigers and the government in Sri Lanka. And Aceh, yes, there was a peace agreement, and some people who make the narrative of that say that what Bill Clinton was talking about was real, and it did actually happen. You look at Sri Lanka, and you could see how actually the aid which came in for the tsunami process helped deepen the divide between the two sides, because not for a second did either the government of Sri Lanka or the Tamil Tigers stop doing politics. And in fact, when the government came to an agreement with the Tigers that allowed them to have a certain amount of control, quite significant amounts of control, over the use of the relief money that was coming in, actually at that point the government fell. Right. So in other words, if you're telling the story about the re-escalation of the conflict in Sri Lanka in 95, 96, the aftermath of the tsunami is a part of that story. And I say that because that was when tens of thousands of people had been killed. That was when human misery was all around you. That was when surely, if ever, you would get politics would be put to one side for that moment. There have been cases where that kind of pressure from nature has a productive effect on relations between country governments. So I'll give the counter-example, which is Greece and Turkey. In August 1999, in a year in which there had been a severe crisis between Greece and Turkey because the Öcalan, who's the leader of the PKK, the Kurdish group, had been discovered on his way out of the Greek embassy in Nairobi. And the Turks took exception to this. They managed to arrest him. They took him back to Turkey. They put him on trial and so on. And, of course, there was a horrible and awful crisis between Turkey and Greece. The Greek government was looking for ways of developing a rapprochement with Turkey. And in August 1999, there was a very serious earthquake in Istanbul. And the Greek government immediately responded with flying aid in. And I remember a headline in one of the major Turkish newspapers. The headline was "Bravo Yorgi," Yorgi being Yorgi Papandreou, the Greek foreign minister. The following month, in Athens, there was a much less serious earthquake, and Turkey immediately reciprocated the aid. And this gave rise to the term earthquake diplomacy. Right? But this was also a case where the governments of the two sides were actually looking for a way past their problem. They were looking for a solution, and they they sort of leapt on the earthquake as being a way to do it. So I could imagine that the impact of global warming and climate change gives governments who are looking to find grounds on which to cooperate a way to do that, and a way to provide a narrative which explains to their populations or their political constituencies or their allies why it is necessary to do this. But where you have, India and Pakistan are going to resolve issues between them or not, right? If they do, maybe they will exploit climate change as being a way in which to do that. If they don't want to, climate change is not going to make them. Right? Climate change will be politically instrumentalized rather than be a political driving force in that kind of context that you were talking about.
Okay, Judy?
So I'm Judy Oglethorpe from the World Wildlife Fund, and thank you both very much for your presentations. Shruti, I had a comment for you. I really liked the way you articulated that the climate discussion has come from the environmental sector, and we need the right expertise when we come to roll out adaptation in the development sector and peace-building sectors. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that even, because I think it needs to come back again so that the people working in the peace building and the development sectors also need to take on environmental aspects. So it needs to come full circle, because we need to do adaptation that not only works for people in the short term, but also works for the environment, because it's the environment that's going to be supporting people in the long term. If we really want adaptation activities to be sustainable, we need to take into account what impacts they're going to have on the environment. Hopefully they can be done in a way that it has a positive impact on the environment and doesn't just put more stress on natural systems, because if it does, then they're not going to support people in the future. I mean, for example, if people are migrating to higher ground, if they move to vulnerable hillsides and deforest areas, which people are dependent on for water supplies, then water supplies are going to fail at a time when environmental systems are under so much pressure anyway. So we need to kind of make that come full circle. We need everybody talking to everybody, absorbing everybody's expertise, if you like, really multidisciplinary.
I think I'd absolutely agree that the sort of conundrum of sustainable development and getting it right in a lot of ways is represented in the idea that those sort of stovepipes of environmental issues and development issues not coming together in the right way. I mean, to your point about sort of ecosystem services, broadly speaking, and the relationship between biodiversity, climate change, and human security is essential. And yes, absolutely, the development people need to be linking in with environmental organizations to be able to have that sort of joined up conversation to answer these questions correctly. So absolutely agree.
I think it has immediate practical and policy implications as well. If you take a case of a country like Liberia coming out of civil war, one of the things to do with former combatants and with IDPs is, of course, return them or help them to return to the villages where they came from, where they were living an agricultural life. Now, if you were to conclude from what climate data and projections are available that, in fact, agriculture is going to be less viable in certain parts of Liberia, especially near the coast, then you would be returning recent ex-combatants to a very marginal livelihood, which, given that they have combat experience and also deep psychological scars out of having been soldiers during their teen years, could well be returning them to crime or conflict within a 10-year period. Right? So then your peace-building policy, by not having been climate-proofed, would be going completely wrong. So those links absolutely have to be made, and you're completely right to point out it's by no means one way.
Mm-hmm. I think ultimately, too, this is a good expression back to Seth's original question and how hard it is to give very concrete examples of the good and the bad and the ugly in terms of it's done. This conversation has largely not occurred. Mm. And the people in the chairs for the climate process are really on the climate science and the diplomacy that is focused on mitigation. And we're starting to see more and more groups that are outside that narrow community, such as International Alert, a lot of the development ones, producing reports that kind of put out there analytically, here's how these things are, here are the broader set of links that we need to take into account. Just starting to have questions about institutions, but in some ways, for example, that governance structure, going into the meeting that made that decision, everyone assumed that'd go through the bank and it would have some, for better or worse, decision-making structure that reflected that. And G77 said no, and kind of within 2 weeks it was, okay, well, there's a different decision structure. So there's not that kind of longer considered institutional development pattern. Again, for better or for worse, not passing judgment on the outcome of it, but these conversations are either just starting or not happening with the multiple set of actors that you've done. So you make the first link. So Oxfam looks at climate, or CARE looks at climate, but it's not yet then with you guys, and let alone the conflict, security, peace building, technical, or the government or intergovernmental side of the house. NGOs perhaps are farther along. Well, I know there are a number of additional questions, but we have unfortunately come to the end of the discussion. I will urge you to continue to be in dialogue with Dan and Shruti and International Alert. You'll be able to find a summary and links and video and such on our website. We hope you will both refer to that yourself and share it with others, and continue to engage with us here at the center. So please join me in thanking our guests for a very lively discussion today.